Welcome back, YouTube. I'm the Planet Rocks, and here we are for another playthrough of Requiescence. So, let us begin. The cave ceiling ahead slopes steeply down, and soon it's only a few feet above our heads, forming a narrow tunnel. For a few moments I followed Damian along quietly. From his rapid strides, it's almost like he's trying to lose me in the darkness of the tunnel. But it's not long before his airy voice echoes out again, and he throws a glance over his shoulder at me.
Chimeo, eh? Not a bad name. Why do you pronounce it like that? Chimeo.
He repeats my name under his breath, snorting lightly. Sounds like the name of a mountain dweller. You from the Royals, boy?
I lived close to the Royal Mountains, yes. You've been there?
When I catch up to him, I give him a sidelong glance as I hurry to match his pace.
A few times. It was something of a pilgrimage with a privilege back in my city.
You'd always see a bunch of nobles puffed up in their finest furs to travel north. Honestly, cold climates aren't to my personal taste, but I suppose you must like them a great deal. He speaks so casually that it's as if we're on a pleasant stroll through castle gardens, not in the dark depths of this strange cave. I'm not sure if I find his mannerisms comforting or disturbing.
I do like them, yes, but I've seen many different lands in my travels south. The dark plains I had to ride in for the last week or so have been unpleasant.
I shiver slightly, just thinking about that black, desolate ground that I was stuck in for days after days fills me with dread. Damian nods in grim agreement with my words.
Ah, yes. It must not have been a pleasant ride alone.
You weren't alone? His lips curl into a smug grin. No, luckily I had an entourage of young, aspiring adventurers like yourself following me along. I told them I was helping them gain traveling experience, but in reality I think I'd just go mad if there was no one to talk to. I'm fairly sure I'd go mad if I had to talk to this man for an extended period.
In fact, I'm almost glad you came here. I was seriously contemplating trying to train one of those hounds, so that I'd have someone to chat with.
I'm flattered. Although I definitely don't like this man, I have to agree with him. It's been a while since I've heard another voice, and I hadn't realized I missed it. Though at this rate, I'll probably wind up wishing I had the silence back. Deciding to change the subject, I speak up again.
Why did you come to the cathedral?
Most likely for the same reasons you did.
He replies without missing a beat.
And what reasons were those?
You tell me. They're your reasons.
You're not answering my question.
Come now. Are we really going to argue semantics?
I can't tell if he's messing with me or he's actually this stupid. But then, he flashes me a broad grin, wearing an expression much like a satisfied cat.
I came here rather by happenstance.
It's something of a long story if I were to give you all of it. I tense. A long story by this man's definition would kill me before the cathedral could. Damian continues in a cheerful tone as we walk along, ducking under a rock that extends down from the ceiling.
The short of it? Well, you see, I was just traveling through the realms as I often do.
In a small town I was passing through, I found a party of young Oh, I already told you about them, didn't I? He lets out an awkward laugh. This guy is really something.
The ones you took along for experience?
Well, he lifts a hand to scratch at the back of his head.
They were young, and a little naive, you know.
They told me about the cathedral, you see, and I offered to keep them safe during their journey here. And then when we got to the gates, I told them I'd scout ahead and come back if I didn't get murdered by anything.
I may also have said they ought to leave if I didn't return within an hour. So there is that.
So that's what happened to them. He sheepishly clears his throat.
So, what you're saying is, you basically stole the idea of going to the cathedral from these people you were traveling with, then tricked them into letting you claim the spoils?
Damian gives me a highly offended look.
Well, if you want to frame me in such a malicious light, you go ahead and say it like that.
Personally, I think they all would have been slaughtered horribly by now. Not much you can do to save people in over their heads.
Maybe it would have been better that way.
They're just going to run off to another dungeon and get slaughtered there, more than likely. He lets out a delighted chuckle. A realist, I like that. We're going to get along famously. As we speak, he leads me through the dark stone tunnels that the formerly huge cave eventually narrows into. The smell is terrible. My eyes start to water. The light of my torch wavers, but it keeps burning as we wind left, right, and left again, heading deeper into the darkness.
Do you have any idea where you're going?
I question him skeptically. He seems to be blindly moving forward. None at all. Glad to hear.
Well, you see, in my time at the cathedral, I've noticed two things about this place.
We reach an intersection of tunnels, and Damian beckons for me to hand him my torch. I reluctantly comply, offering it out to him. He takes the torch and uses its light to peer into the left tunnel, then the right. After some deliberation, he sets off down the left tunnel, still carrying my torch. I guess I won't be getting that back anytime soon. Damian casts a side glance at me, pursing his lips together.
The first thing is that the architecture makes little to no sense.
You've noticed it too? The strange, abrupt transition from a massive hall into an icy cave. It'd be impossible, or at least improbable, in a normal place. Damian nods with a sour expression, his chest rising and falling with a light sigh.
Whether these walls and tunnels were made by men or not is anyone's guess.
Perhaps they're born of a magic known only to old wizards with their noses buried in ancient dusty tomes. He pauses, his brow furrowing as he glances around. It looks like we've hit a dead end. No, wait. From the faint glow of the torch, I can see what looks like small footholds in the rock wall, allowing someone to climb up the tunnel like a ladder. They're small, curved metal bars, so surely they've been inserted here by someone.
Now the second observation is one that may surprise you a little more. Considering you've been riding on my coattails all the way through this place.
He's really not going to let that one slide, is he? I watch as Damian starts to climb up the wall, holding the torch carefully in one hand while grasping the metal bars with his other. His boots make a soft dinging sound every time they hit the metal.
And what makes this observation so surprising?
I start to follow behind him, climbing the makeshift ladder more easily than he can, since I have both of my hands free. I can see that the tunnel leads up into somewhere with a brighter source of light. When I try to look up past Damian, I can spot what looks curiously like an arched ceiling through a sewer grate?
Damian?
He's gone quiet, which is probably a bad sign. But I hear grunting from above me, along with the clinking of metal. It looks like he's fiddling with something. Blasted ner. The damn torch just came hurtling past my face. It lands far below us on the ground with a distant thud. Give me a warning next time. I cry up irritatedly towards Damian, but I hear no reply. Instead, there's just the sound of metal clanking again, this time louder. A soft bluish light streams down towards me. I look up to see Damian lifting the grate, pulling himself up through it and onto the ground a moment later, crawling out of sight. I hastily climb up the last few ladder rungs to follow suit, hoisting myself up through the grate without too much effort. The floor I pull myself onto is cold and smooth, marked only by the small sewer grate we came out of. Damian sits on the marble tile beside me, staring ahead distractedly.
The second observation I've made is that half of the things you see here are nothing but damnable illusions.
Illusions? What do you mean illusions? This doesn't seem... Ah. A chill of understanding runs down my spine as I follow Damian's gaze. Through a nearby window, I can see the pale moon through the trees. Trees? Does that mean we're on the surface? As I gaze through the window in awe, Damian snorts and pushes himself up to his feet.
We have to be a great distance below the surface still, after all those stairs leading downwards.
He declares this contemptfully as he brushes himself off.
And you saw for yourself how there wasn't a tree in sight in the cathedral. You'd have to travel a week before you glimpsed any sort of foliage.
He points through the window. It looks like it might have once been stained glass, but now it's too faded and cracked for the art to be recognizable. This place is trying to drive us mad. Don't believe any of it for a second. It seems pretty real to me, but what Damian says makes sense. There's no way that the forest out there can actually exist. The dead plains stretched on for endless leagues around the cathedral. But that makes me wonder, what other things have I seen might have just been illusions? I push myself slowly up to my feet, tilting my head upwards to gaze at the beautifully arched ceiling. What about this corridor? I nod to the hall in front of us. For the first time in a while, it looks like we're back in some sort of cathedral-esque structure. The moonlight streams in through the windows, but the idea that it's not real makes an unpleasant tingle course through me. Damian seems to hesitate at my words, as if he's unsure of how to reply. I believe the rooms themselves are real, but I wouldn't trust them, nor anything I saw in them. He strides over to one of the windows, rapping his knuckles on the pane with a frown.
Gods only know how many illusions I've had leap at my face. How many doors I've had to pass through, only to have them vanish before my eyes, or lead right back to where I was 20 paces prior.
I can't help but think his suddenly dark demeanor is a little unsettling, especially since I was getting accustomed to his cheery voice. Then, the guilt I felt earlier rushes back to me. What kind of things did Damian have to face back by the cathedral's entrance? Although I know it's not my fault that I came after him, I feel a bit sheepish for having threatened him so boldly earlier. He's probably had to endure a lot just getting here, while all I encountered were empty hallways. The one thing I did kill was some unlucky serpent, apparently. Shaking my head lightly, I pushed the irrational guilt aside. Whatever it was that he had to fight through, I could have too. Besides, he's probably the type to exaggerate things a lot to make himself sound much braver than he actually is. And anyway, I'll prove to him sooner or later that I'm not just some foolish adventurer. Hefting my pack, I start to walk down the corridor, my footsteps echoing back to me. I hear Damian following closely behind, muttering quietly to himself. In the distance, I can make out a rectangular shape tucked into a corner. When we draw close, I can quickly see that it's an altar, a thin slab of marble that looks very familiar. Damian soon passes me, with his long stride stepping up onto the dais. He props one hand on his hip and strokes his smooth chin with the other, frowning thoughtfully down at the altar. Awfully decorative, isn't it? Unlike that one back at the entrance of this blasted place. Now that he mentions it, I do notice some differences. There are dried flowers scattered around the altar's base, as well as various beads in dull, dust-covered urns. I also notice a lot of coins scattered around, gleaming tantalizingly in the light. And then in the center of the altar, there's a small pale crystal that protrudes from the dark marble. It's faintly tinged with crimson, but otherwise translucent. It seems a bit oddly out of place. I wonder if this altar is as sinister in nature as the previous one. The magic seems a little different, though. It's more potent somehow. Curiously, I glance up to Damian.
At the first altar, did you have to spill blood to get past it?
Damian, who is eyeing the small crystal suspiciously, turns to me and lets out a snort.
Of course. I had to blemish my perfect complexion with a cut in order to sate the damn thing.
He gives a disapproving shake of his head. We both stare at the altar for a few long moments in curious silence. I finally speak up quietly.
Do you think there's some kind of meaning behind them? The altars, that is.
There's a strong magic that comes from them, and there has to be some powerful force that created it. His lips twisting in an expression of thought, Damian gives a slow shake of his head.
I'm not really sure. They're quite odd, obviously, and I'd wager they've stood here for many years.
He muses as he rubs a hand along the side of his neck, exhaling a sigh. I know piss all about magic, but I think it's wise to be careful around these things. Magic in general makes me a tad uneasy, and this sort seems especially fishy. I nod in understanding. Every mage is acutely attuned to magic, but this magic in particular is overwhelming, like a potent bitterness. Damian raises his head and glances around us briefly, wearing a dissatisfied expression.
What troubles me more, honestly, is the lack of doors leading out of this room.
I scan the place skeptically at his words, but it's true. No doors.
There has to be some way out of here.
A secret passage or something, surely. Damian gives me a dubious look. I'm not going back into those tunnels, if that's what you're planning on suggesting. The memory of the horrible smell, combined with the discouraging thought of having to backtrack, makes me more than a little unhappy.
I don't know about you, but it seems like a better idea to explore down there than rot as corpses up here.
A dry smirk then rises to his lips as he rolls his eyes at me.
What's the matter? Worried the damp floor might stain your boots?
I might not survive another journey on the ladder after you nearly burned me to a crisp with that torch. At that, Damian gives a quiet cough and rubs at the back of his head with a hand. I heave a sigh and slide slowly to the ground with my back against the altar. Leaning heavily back against it, I pull my knees up to my chest. All my exhaustion from traveling is finally catching up to me, now that my initial excitement at finding the cathedral's worn off. I feel incredibly tired, like I've missed a week's worth of sleep. Damian lingers in place for a long moment before finally lowering himself to sit beside me. My eyes drift closed and I let myself linger deep in my thoughts. Thoughts of a lot of things. My mother, my home, all of the people and places I've left behind. Slowly, a familiar doubt creeps into my heart. Is this all really worth it? Abandoning my homeland, risking my life for the hope that I'll find some clue to Gideon's death. I've made it so far, and yet now that I'm finally here, I feel almost lost.
You're fairly young, aren't you?
Damian's sudden, curious voice breaks through my haze. I shoot a glance over at him beside me, blinking. He's watching me with one eyebrow raised, his head canted inquisitively to one side. Is he really trying to make fun of me again? My suspicious expression must be evident, because he quickly tries to clarify his words.
I mean, you look rather unseasoned, you know. There aren't any hairs on your chin even.
Why does this even matter in our current situation?
I'm around 19 winters.
And you're not exactly sporting a bushy beard either. Why do you ask? Damian gives a satisfied nod, like I just confirmed whatever he was thinking.
Sounds about right, I suppose. You've got that narrow single-mindedness of youth still strong about you.
Quick to tunnel in on a goal, unable to see the other paths that lead the same way. This guy. He seriously can't be more than a year or two older than I am, and yet he's talking like he's my grandfather or something. Listen, I don't need your lecturing. Besides, aren't you around my age? I'm 24, you know. I find that hard to believe. Well, I know I'm very well kept and handsome, but I'm half a decade older than you are. Half a decade. He makes it sound like that gives him a lifetime's more experience than me. And what does that have to do with anything?
I'm just saying that you seem like a dangerously rash boy. You speak and act before you think. You said you've traveled a year, but for what exactly? Do you even know why you're here?
The question catches me off guard, just like when the monk asked me the same thing. Sharing my reasoning with someone else seems like a bad idea, especially when I hardly know them. And I guess I see it as something of a sacred secret, something that only I know. It almost feels like it'd be less pure if I were to share it with anyone. Besides, can I even trust Damian? Well, do you?
My reasons are none of your business.
Damian stares at me with narrowed eyes for a long moment, before eventually shaking his head with an irritated sigh.
Well, excuse me for trying to learn a little more about the parasite who attached himself to me during my journey.
Letting out a huff, he pushes himself up to his feet and brushes himself off. He turns around to face the altar, brushing his palm against the smooth surface. More of these blasted runes.
You can read Pekatum too?
The ancient runic language used by scholars and mages isn't widely known today. Few people can understand it.
Well, I may not be a mage, but that didn't stop me from teaching myself the tongue after I found a book on it in the library.
He lets out an evil laugh. It infuriated my nosy siblings when I started writing my journal in runes. Clearing his throat, he glances back down to the altar, squinting down at the surface. I peer around his shoulder, scanning over the runes. Give unto the ones who need, that from which a life may flow. Cut out all your earthly greed. From the ashes all will grow. Another strange message, like the one on the first altar. Damian's brow furrows as he drums his fingers on the altar's surface, looking lost in thought. After a long moment, he lets out a single muttered word. Damn.
It's got to be the same thing as the first altar.
That from which a life may flow? What else can that be besides blood? For that matter, what sort of sadist bastard designed these things? I don't like it either, but we have to do whatever's necessary to get past.
Well then, if you're so eager to go through with it, why don't you show me how it's done?
He shoots me an accusing look, raising his eyebrows expectantly. Well, I should have known he'd retort with something like that. Sighing, I reach down to the pommel of my sword in order to grasp it. But, to my shock, a sudden spark runs abruptly through my fingers when I touch the metal. I yank my hand back reflexively, quickly glancing down at my sword. It looks the same as it always has. What's the matter? No, it's nothing. I turn away from his scrutinizing gaze and face towards the altar. What was that? It felt just like when I touched that door earlier. A strange tingling sensation, causing a numbness in the very core of my body. I hesitate to touch my sword in case it causes that spark to jump at me again. But then, letting out an irritated sigh, Damian reaches out and grabs at the blade hanging by my side, pulling it out of its sheath with a fluid motion.
Hey, what the hell are you...
I freeze mid-sentence. The sword doesn't seem to have any effect on Damian. Instead, he just raises it up to examine the decorations on the hilt and guard, eyes narrowed appraisingly.
This is a blade of unusually fine make.
What's a clueless brat like you doing with something like this? He hefts the sword in one hand, giving it a testing swing through the air. A burst of anger rushes through me, and I lunge out to grab the blade from him. But he doesn't put up a fight, and lets me snatch it back. I pause then, bracing for the tingling sensation to come back, but nothing happens. I wonder if it was some sort of residual energy from earlier. Either way, it's a little unsettling. Focusing back on Damian, I glare at him and mutter an annoyed reply. It's my uncle's sword. And if anyone's a brat here, it's you. Do you just go around taking other people's things? Sorry about that.
Your uncle's, eh? Well, why don't you put that pretty blade to use and stop standing here like a bloody idiot,
Since answering him will obviously get me nowhere, I just throw a dark look at Damian before rolling my sleeve up. The cut at my forearm has sealed over again, but the red line looks worse than before. I'd better be careful or I'm going to wind up with a scar. Not wanting to hesitate any longer because of Damian's inevitable snide comments, I nick the blade against my skin. As drops of blood start to pool at the surface of the cut, I glance down to the pale crystal I noticed earlier. It protrudes from the top of the altar, small and fragile. That seems as good a place as any to have the blood fall on. Rather than letting the dark liquid trickle down drop by drop, I decide to open the cut a little more. A tiny stream drops down from my skin onto the crystal. Then, before my eyes, the crystal starts to turn a deep dark red. A soft swirling crimson light spreads through it, but it only covers half of the crystal. Bloody hell. Damian lets out a bemused murmur watching the crystal. Suddenly, the crystal starts to grow. Not upward, but out. Like a disease spreading through a body, a multitude of small crystals start to bleed out over the surface of the altar, protruding from the stone. Within a few moments, the sudden growth stops, but the crystals remain in place. A sense of dread fills me, and I swallow hard. Should we really go through with this?
As much as your common sense seems to be screaming at me not to, I'm not sure we have a choice.
With a solemn grimace, Damian raises his head to glance around. It didn't open a passageway. What sort of foolery is this? The crystal. I point to the single largest shard in the center of the altar. It's only half-colored. Don't you think it needs mine too? Damian interrupts me with a questioning, displeased look, and I nod in confirmation.
Isn't this exactly what they teach you not to do in mage school? Or wherever the hell you learn magic?
I never went to a mage school, but I don't think they encourage blood rituals, no. Damian lets out a heavy sigh and holds out a hand, gesturing for me to give him my sword. Well, the last altar didn't seem to have any horrible consequences, so hand it over. I'll finish this. Without argument, I offer him my sword, and he quickly brings the edge up to his arm. He carefully nicks the blade against his skin, opening a small cut with such precision that it's almost surgical. When a thin stream starts to trickle from his wound, he hastily raises his hand over the crystal so that the drops can fall onto it. As Damian's blood pools around the crystal, the crimson light slowly spreads throughout the rest of it. Immediately, the red crystals start to spread over the altar again, until the whole thing is covered with bright shards. With each crystal holding a pulsing ruby light, it's almost as if the altar has become a living thing. Damian and I wait with bated breath, neither of us exchanging a word. A long, excruciatingly drawn-out few seconds pass, and then... On the right side of the wall, what looked like a normal part of the stone suddenly starts to move. I watch as it slowly opens into a narrow tunnel, much like the ones we just came from. After a long moment of staring at the blanket of crystals now covering the altar, Damian shakes his head and turns towards me. Briefly, a complex, heavy expression hangs on his features, unlike his usual wry look. But within a split second, it's quickly replaced by a light smirk, and he lets out a relieved sigh.
A bittersweet victory, but you did well.
Damian gives me a light pat on the shoulder as he passes by me, heading to the newly opened entrance. Alrighty guys, I think for today, that is going to be the video. Thank you so much for joining me. I am the Planet Rocks, and again, there will be a video of Requiesence loaded up next week. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, hit the bell for notifications, and please do like this video. You can also find me on Twitter at the Planet Rocks. And again, thank you so much for joining me. I am the Planet Rocks, and I will see you next week.